Welcome everybody to the first in our Academy of Urbanism Congress Fringe 3x3 series of events. Really good to see so many of you here today, and we've got a really good mixture of members and non-members, so welcome to everybody. This event is part of the Fringe of the AoU Congress 2021, taking place in Edinburgh in June. We'll send some more information about that afterwards. It's online, but focused on the city of Edinburgh. Before we start, we'd like to say a big thank you to the organising team of the 3x3, drawn from members of the AoU who've worked really hard over the last few months contacting speakers and putting the event together. So thank you very much to them, we really appreciate it. And thanks also to our series sponsors, Collective Architecture, Igloo and Ibstock Brick, for their support for the three events and for the series. And I'm very pleased to pass over to our chair for this event, Dr. Zoe Strachan. Zoe, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. And thank you everyone for coming along this afternoon. Welcome. Huge thanks to the Academy of Urbanism for trusting us to kick off the 2021 Congress Fringe. So tonight, myself, Louise Welsh, Lily Heise and Will Jennings have the enviable task of exploring romance in the city. Louise is a best-selling and critically acclaimed novelist whose work often explores the darker side of life in the city. Lily is a writer and journalist who has travelled the world finding its most romantic spots. And Will has published extensively on architecture, cities, society and culture. I'm a writer too across different forms and genres, and I work on transdisciplinary academic research projects. So today I think we're each going to take you through some of our own ideas of romance and the city, and then we'll have time for chat and questions afterwards. So first up, I'm very pleased to welcome our romance expert, Lily. Lily, shall I hand over to you and we'll just get started?
Thank you for having me here today. I am here in Paris. Yes, so I am a travel writer, author, and romantic expert in Paris, so kind of a self-designated title because I do scour the planet in search of the most romantic places. And I write on travel for various international publications and guidebooks. I'm also the author of 2 books on looking for romance in Paris, as well as a new book of short stories on pandemic Paris, which really kind of focuses in on our current experience and Paris. And I also run a website where I showcase these romantic ideas, and it's called Je t'aime me neither. And the idea is that we're kind of looking at perhaps a different take on romance. And so I feature articles on Paris, specific themes, as well as restaurants, bars, and romantic travel guides. And so while I'm traveling, I'm always looking out for the most romantic spots. And we're going to delve a little bit deeper into these romantic spots as well. So you might be asking yourselves what makes a place romantic. And what's very interesting recently, perhaps over the last 2 decades, and also with the kind of boom of the internet and us being able to access more information, our travel habits and our desires have changed. And so when we are looking for perhaps a destination for a romantic getaway or something romantic to do even in our own cities, we aren't looking for this sort of cliche that used to be a little bit more prominent. So we're moving away from these kind of overly popularized ideas of what romance is, instead of just going and putting on a love log or writing on a love wall. we're seeking something a little bit more authentic and local. And I do think Instagram has also helped with sending people to discover more hidden and interesting places. So maybe secret spots like this site here in Verona. And we're going to now just kind of talk a little bit more about these types of sites, because one of the most important thing for me is escaping crowds, because crowds don't really have the don't really set the romantic tone. And if you want a romantic experience, you want something that's a little bit more intimate and a little bit more hidden. Sometimes that involves just going a little bit off the beaten path. It doesn't even have to be, seeking some quirky offbeat neighborhood. Instead, it could be just around the corner from some of these popular sites. And for example, you can enjoy the Eiffel Tower from many perspectives that don't involve the massive crowds that are just next to it. But what's more in these special places that I look for and I try to recommend and I feel are very romantic are places which evoke the essence of the destination. And so perhaps that is a place that's removed from the crowds, but that gives you this feeling of the destination, whether that be in Bangkok, like we just saw, or in Venice. And so Venice, of course, one of the most crowded places in the world. There are ways in order to enjoy it thoroughly. There's a St. Mark's Square across the canal, and we have this beautiful serene monastery where there is probably virtually no one. Or what makes the destination tick. And so here we have a kind of offbeat, more alternative neighborhood in Marseille, where you can go for a wander and enjoy street art, no cars. So we're a bit away from that kind of noisy buzz of the city and experiencing it on another level. And so often I like to recommend intimate places, and these can be well-known places, or a little bit more hidden, as we're going to see, but places that kind of take the tone down and provide you with a picturesque or interesting or alluring setting in order to have a romantic moment with your partner. This can be in the heart of the city, but these little kind of oases of tranquility or beauty. Again, here is the cloisters in Venice. So we're a 5-minute ride from the mayhem, but here we're just kind of taking this special moment together in this beautiful setting. I like to recommend, and I'm always on the lookout for hidden romantic spots. And once again, they can be in the heart of the city, but these are special places that, or perhaps, this hidden aspect, by taking your partner to a hidden place, it accentuates the emotion of the experience, preferably if there aren't many people there as well, because it's a little more hidden, that will leave the spot for you and your loved one. In Paris, there are many, but then across the world I'm always looking for these kind of unique spots that will create this little bit of an element of surprise, but also this place away from the crowds. Often these are gardens, but not always. And sometimes a beautiful historic place has been converted into a garden. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. But I think that also means you're away from traffic, you're away from too much noise, so you can focus on being with your loved one, whether that be from Malta to Hidden Garden in Paris. Lesser known cultural sites are also a good place to go with your loved one. So instead of going to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, why not go to the Van Leeuw House Museum, which is a very special place. Not many people go there, and it has this lovely hidden garden in the back as well, where there's a little cafe. Or perhaps in Rome, instead of being pushed around by the crowds at the Vatican, we've got the Dori Pamphili Gallery, which is just a true gem, but has a fraction of the crowds. And so there is a way of getting that essence of place, but without visiting the kind of top sites in a destination and having this kind of more intimate experience. Another example, I really love these house museums, which give this kind of a cozy ambiance and kind of, a story to tell as well. So there can be bigger, more famous sites, but that have a special allure. And so whether that be going to the opera or visiting a famous monastery, these are magical places, enchanting places, which again are places where you can create special memories. A few more examples of places that, kind of set this tone of the destination that you're in. I also feel, and I think that this is an interesting point when thinking about urbanism and planning as well, is finding unique vantage points. And this can be lookouts or a way to view a certain destination. And so whether that be up high in a tower or from various viewpoints. Here we have Rio de Janeiro, which is a very hilly place, and getting up high will create this feeling of awe. And so if you're with your loved one and in this very special place, those are the kind of settings that can create these special memories that you are establishing together. Again, a few more examples of soaring views. But it isn't only about these kind of vast soaring perspectives that you can get around the world. It can be also looking up. And so here we have around Athens, we have various beautiful vantage points of the Acropolis. So you're enjoying this very famous and beautiful place, but again, away from the crowds, having a more intimate experience of it. And then Edinburgh Castle, I threw that in for our friends in the academy up in Scotland. Again, you're enjoying the place from these various vantage points. One of the most romantic vantage points in many destinations is also along the water. And so here are a few examples, and I'm going to talk about more, again, enjoying famous sites, but along the water where you can have this kind of very special feeling. The water always evokes tranquility and a certain allure and certain magic. And so, of course, Venice is a perfect example, but you can enjoy the Venetian canals either on the water or walking through the canals, especially if you get off the beaten path. You can have some very beautiful settings where there's no one around. You can, as I mentioned, enjoy a city if there is water there by boat, which does offer a unique vantage point and can be particularly romantic. Renting boats on lakes, but that's an interesting way to experience the place. And I find that does kind of take you away from the crowds as well. And then we have a few other cities that have these beautiful evocative vantage points. Again, water adding a little special element, even in London. And so as far as Vancouver as well. Water doesn't only have to be from a body of water, it can be created. And I think that's an interesting point, and we're going to see some examples of that. Of course, Rome is famous for its fountains, and those create this kind of special ambiance. Also, it has to do with sound as well, kind of creating this serene, magical feeling. We've got Marrakesh as well. North Africa is famous for its fountains too. And in addition to water and kind of creating this enhanced ambiance, lighting also can create a romantic setting in the city. And that is an especially evocative time to perhaps take a stroll with your loved one and seeing these monuments lit up or other things lit up at night. It also is a slightly quieter time, and so perhaps there won't be as many people walking around. And so you can enjoy the place with a tranquil ambiance, but the lighting, which adds to the allure and the feeling. But sometimes we want to enjoy a place in the evening and have an evening ambiance, which is lively, and that is also romantic. if you are in a more modern place or a place that has a lot of electric energy, that can be very exciting and stimulating for a romantic experience too, whether you're kind of tango dancing in Buenos Aires or walking under the bright lights of Hong Kong or along the Bund in Shanghai. And that also has to do with experiencing of a place over a meal. I won't talk too much about this because it's a little bit less linked to our topic. However, it's finding these places which do evoke the destination and are in quiet, tranquil, and beautiful places. So again, here we have an example of along the water, and then a historic bistro in Paris, or some kind of bars, and lighting, of course, is important in these places too. So whether it be outside or inside, this kind of evening ambiance and experiencing the city at night, I feel is, of course, very romantic too. So a topic which might come up with some of the other speakers too is, can new places be romantic? And I have to say yes, because here is an example of Osaka in Japan, and whether that was a temple in the background or these kind of modern buildings, I still find the setting very evocative of the destination and very romantic. And I think that that is a great way for urban planners or kind of people thinking about the designs of the city. There are ways in which to make new places romantic. And I have a few other examples. Sometimes that involves repurposing of historic places. And so here we have the Coulée Verte, it's the Promenade Plantée in Paris, which was a refurbished raised train line. It was kind of the original High Line. And so up above is all new. However, it is in a very specific and interesting place, which is terribly romantic. Again, another example of kind of a new take on a historic rundown place. So the docks area in Leeds is a wonderful place to walk around. They've done a great job in order for people to enjoy the city, but also be a little bit away from noise, again, next to the water, and also have these interesting historic perspectives along the way. But it doesn't only have to be this kind of historic refurbishment. Taking in Hong Kong's architecture is really quite exciting. And so that's a very interesting city, but of course its location surrounded by these large hills, it does add to its allure as well, but kind of taking in, a unique perspective of the city. On the right, we have an example in Vancouver, where Vancouver is very modern. You've got these glass skyscrapers all over the place, but then right in the middle of the city, we have this beautiful garden, which looks like it was transposed from Asia, but it was built in the 1980s. Once again, new being exciting and romantic, the charge you get from seeing these city lights, whether it be in Hong Kong or in the heart of New York, can also be very romantic. But keeping in mind, going back to the point I made near the beginning, is that they're evocative of the place, the essence of the destination. And so for New York, it is nice. And part of the reason why people go to New York is to have the exciting charge of the city. And right in the heart of New York are some of the most romantic places. New York has some very beautiful pocket gardens. And so here are a few examples. And so these little micro modern gardens, which do play off of the place. And so it is possible to bring about some of those characteristics, which I mentioned before, in the historic or natural places, and kind of imbuing them in a new destination and making it quite exciting. If you look at the garden on the left, you've got the reflections as well of the green space within this modern architecture. So it's really quite nice. Or the faux waterfall in the other garden on the right. And I find a really great example of this, kind of the new and the old coming together, but making new beautiful in London at the Barbican Estate and Centre. And so it's an example of brutalist architecture, but next to it we have juxtaposed historic sites, but also really nice sitting areas. And so again, we're removed from traffic. We're in this little microcosm of London, and we have these water pools as well. So it tends to bring together many of the aspects which I've been talking about. And this more recent walkway is also very cleverly done and is a great place for a romantic stroll in London, because you're going past these ancient ruins and then you have these modern buildings as well that you're walking through. So I find it very successful. And if you can get into the atrium, it's often closed. Hidden up above inside the building is this wonderful, one of the most beautiful modern gardens I've ever seen. And so I find that this is a successful place of bringing together these kind of attributes of what makes a romantic place in one place and in a modern place. And so, speaking of our current situation, the pandemic has only accentuated all of this, because who wants to be in a crowd right now? And so I think more and more people will be seeking these places that are away from the crowds, that are intimate places that you might have all to yourself. And so I think as we're going forward, and already starting from last year when we were allowed to go out again, and when we're allowed to go out once again, people are going to be searching for these lesser known offbeat places which allow you to be away from the crowds safely, but also creating this special moment together with your loved one. So merci, thank you very much. And I'm sure some of these ideas will play nicely off what the other speakers have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lily. I'm sure that everyone else enjoyed having such a magical journey through all the places that we would like to travel to but can't just now. You absolutely brought them to life for us. So we have an opportunity now to attempt to scan the QR code and join in with the interactive element of that. So we'll leave this on screen for a moment for you to take part in this or plan the wonderful romantic holiday that you're going to have once lockdown restrictions are eased. And so nice too, Lily, that you ended on a positive point there and reminded us that for all the unpleasant aspects of lockdown, in some ways it has brought us closer to the local places, the places we live and the people that we're very close to. Oh, here we go. We're going to discover perhaps what's the most romantic city in the world. Oh, some good contenders, but Paris still looking like the winner. Yep, Paris is still there at the top. What makes a city romantic? This will be interesting. Is it the intimacy, the quiet spots, or the lively squares and the dancing or the restaurants? Maybe not so many answers to this one, but something that I'm sure we're going to come back to. Oh, here we go. Oh, nice. Overgrowth, that's a nice one. And lots of things that I think we'll come to, much as we might be craving bars. And nice to start thinking about the different sides of the city already, the public toilets, the red light districts and the cobbled streets and the waterfronts. Brilliant. Thank you for participating in that, everybody. We're now going to hand over to Louise for our next presentation. And I think Louise is going to be sharing her screen as well to take us through some of those different aspects of the city.
Hello, everybody. And Lily, thank you so much for that. I just now want to step out into the world and I want to go to as many of these romantic spots as I can go to. So and I'm looking forward to your book as well. I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm a writer, as Zoe said. I'm a writer of novels, librettos, other things, and my work has political underpinnings and it engages with genres such as crime and Gothic, and that's the filter that I am going to look through today. So when I'm thinking about romance in the city, I was trying to define what romance means in my professional world, and I came up with 4 words: mystery, glamour, danger, and violence. And I think this is a tricky intersection between mystery, glamour, danger, and violence. The first 2 words, well, that's absolutely fine. Mystery and glamour. Glittery eyeshadow can be mysterious and glamorous. You might say mystery and glamour keeps it fresh. That's what keeps a lot of relationships alive. Danger and violence are less attractive, and the idea of romanticizing those is problematic. And, you know, of course, I probably don't need to say this, but there are good reasons for this. When it comes down to it, in real life, there's nothing at all romantic about being beaten up or worse. There's nothing romantic about the shootings that we've seen, the murders that we've seen of unarmed Black people such as Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Dante Wright. There's nothing at all romantic, again, about the recent murders in London of the sisters Nicole Smallman, Biba Henry, or the recent murder of Sarah Everard. And I'm Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Glasgow, where amongst other things, I teach a module in crime fiction, and an element that we come back to again and again are the ethics of writing this kind of fiction, the ethics of genre fiction. And this is something that there's no set answer to. Everybody has their own parameters. Each writer, each reader has their parameters. I contend, though, that mystery, glamour, danger, and violence are repeatedly and sometimes usefully used in the world of to evoke romance in things such as crime fiction and movies, and that the best of these can have a political thrust that changes attitudes and sometimes laws towards those who are otherwise victimized, monstered, or alienated. So crime, of course, is not unique to cities, but there is an association with crime in cities, especially overcrowded cities. And we can go back to Engels and before to see this. There are also places of concealment. They can be places where the rich and the poor rub shoulders. They're places too where people who are marginalized, who are outcast, can hide or find other people. This is The Woman in White, 1860 by Wilkie Collins. And this is a romantic Gothic novel. You see the image here of the woman in white herself. That's inspired partly by the case of Louise Nottage, who was incarcerated in what they would have called then a mental asylum by her husband. And Wilkie Collins is writing against the Married Women's Property Act, which meant as soon as you got married, as soon as a woman married a man, he owned her property, he can take her money, her inheritance, and he can incarcerate her. It's also partly inspired by Wilkie Collins' meeting with his long-term partner, Carolyn Graves, who was being held in a house and managed to escape and ran into Wilkie Collins. So it's as Gothic and romantic as it gets in one way. The woman in white, the woman in a nightdress, running through a warren of streets, running from men and being rescued by another man. Nevertheless, it's socially aware. Collins continues to write against the Married Women's Property Act. So just to place him in time, he's a contemporary of Dickens, and he's writing at a time of increasing awareness of the plight of the poor. There's no welfare state, you know, working people in London. This is the point when children are working in chimneys. And for those of you that are interested in this period, London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, written in the 1840s, is a document which describes the state of working people in their own voices. He interviewed all sorts of people, and this was shocking for Victorians to hear what was going on in their cities. Victorian novels are kind of obsessed with the romance of the city. We have the picture of Dorian Gray, and we also have The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde which is published in 1886. And these are all from different publications and things connected with the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And you see this idea of the hidden streets, the foggy London streets. Stevenson is, of course, thinking about his hometown, where many of you will be hopefully soon, the city of Edinburgh, a city of great precipitous drops, where a doorway may lead into a house in a different street. And this idea of skewing and queering the streets and disorientating people is very much a part of this book. And there's a whole queer reading we could do of this if we had time. Because crime fiction, because sensational Gothic fiction is intimately connected with the politics and what is going on socially at the time, sometimes it seems to predict or anticipate actual events. And a theatrical production of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1888 was taken off the stage because it came out in the same year as the Whitechapel murders, also known as the Jack the Ripper murders, and people became convinced that the main actor was actually the murderer, and they had to take it off. So this idea of social awareness, of politics, of almost, what would you call it, comic violence occupies these iterations of the city and crime. And this, of course, is Raymond Chandler, Humphrey Bogart there reading The Big Sleep. Down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. He is the hero, he is everything. He must be a complete man and a common man, and yet an unusual man. And this reiteration of the word man is not by accident. This is a very masculine iteration of the city. There's something almost comic, I think, about the intensity of this chivalric phrase, and yet it works. And Mean Streets, of course, by Robert De Niro, starring Robert De Niro, directed by Martin Scorsese in 1973. He takes the phrase mean streets from this Chandler quote. So Chandler's hero, Philip Marlowe, named, of course, after a poet, is a man off his time, but out with his time. He is off the city, but out with the city. He's a flaneur of sorts. He's somebody who is not interested in money. He's somebody who can escape corruption because he is above corruption. He's like the knight. Excuse me for this, but it just fits so brilliantly well. And I'm not going to read this entire quote, but in The Simple Art of Murder, Chandler says that the realist in murder, and he's talking against people who write country house type murders, the realist in murder writes of a world in which gangsters can rule nations and almost rule cities. I think this is a lovely idea that it might be more difficult to rule a city than it is to rule a nation. But what he's saying is something similar to what Stevenson is saying in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It is not the crime, it is not perversion, it's in a way not the criminal that we need to fear. It is the respectable person, the person that is doing the big money heist. This is a genre of inversion, and I think it's a genre with strict parameters. And if you do not find yourself represented in it, the idea of inversion, of turning things around, of these parameters, offers in a way templates that you can then use. And this is Chester Himes' second novel, If He Hollers, Let Him Go, published in 1945. And this is a book, if you've not read it, I recommend it to you. Chester Himes is exploring racial injustice through this novel, and it's, of course, something that he has a great deal of experience of. He looks at the impossibility of justice for a central character, Bob Jones. And Bob Jones is newly settled in Los Angeles. He's working in a shipyard. He should have everything going for him. He's young, he's good looking, he's intelligent, he's well read, he's energetic, he's articulate. But over the 4 days that we're with Bob, we realize he can never get ahead in the world that he's in. He can never get any justice because of his colour, of his race, and of the society in which he's in. So where is the romance in this? You know, there's no romance in racial prejudice. There's no romance in injustice, this kind of injustice. And yet, of course, he's tapping into this commercial genre that relies on romance. But it's also a young man's novel. It's a novel written with anger, with energy. It employs sex, it employs fast cars, it employs violence, it employs a threat of violence. And it also employs the same superiority that Marlowe embodies. His character is rising above it. His character is better than the city. His character is better than the circumstances in which he is placed. Heise goes on to write a Harlem, a series of novels, crime novels set in Harlem, and they star two policemen, Gravedigger Jones and Coffin Ed Johnson. These are, again, there's a great deal of comic violence in here, married with very keen social and political representation and insight. And of course, the two police at the center of these this novel and the subsequent movie, they can't fit in anywhere. They don't fit in the Harlem society, and they don't fit in the police society. They're outsiders, and but nevertheless, they're trying to fight for some kind of justice. Great movie that you can stream, set in 1970. Chester Himes was ripped off repeatedly again and again and again by publishers, by movie makers. So the idea of the genre as inversion, the city as a place where outsiders can inhabit. As many of you will know, homosexuality is legalized in England for men over the age of 21 in 1967. And if that seems outrageous, it was legalized in Scotland in 1980. This film, Victim, directed by Dearden and starring Dirk Bogarde and Sylvia Sims, came out in 1961. So it comes out a significant period before the legalization of homosexuality. Dirk Bogarde, who we see here, in a role of kind of flaneur. And you can see a lot of these sites. You know, this is set in London. He plays a barrister who is being blackmailed, and the criminalization of homosexuality became known as the Blackmailer's Charter. And we see marginal and dangerous places in the city. So we see alleyways, we see dark pubs, we see crucially bookshops. Bookshops often appear in these movies as dangerous places, places where there are knowledge, places where people can intersect. You can intersect with people from different societies. It begins with a building site, and this idea of the city being rebuilt, I think, is also important. It's really difficult to emphasize how brave Dirk Bogarde is to do this movie. At this point, he's a heterosexual heartthrob. He's actually a gay man, and to play a gay man on film prior to legalization is just outstandingly brave, really. I think of this as a weird companion to Victim, Villain, which is, you can see the details up there. Again, you can stream this online. And Richard Burton, Victim is full of politeness. Villain is full of the opposite. Richard Burton is more of a Ronnie Cray character. And again, fantastic views of London. This is very influential on the Long Firm, the series of books by Jake Arnott. Here we have a man who is out of his time. The city is being rebuilt. He's set in Brighton and in London. This is a guy who is crude, he's rough. He only knows the old ways of doing things. He's also gay and is the lover of Ian McShane in this, who's bisexual. A great movie to stream if you get the opportunity. I'm going to finish because I'm aware that we're short of time, and I'm going to come a little bit more up to date and hopefully show that sex, violence, mystery, danger, and the city, as Lily said, are existing in modern spaces as well as in cities of the past. And this is directed by Heise and starring Zhao To and Lei Fan. Ash is the purest white. You can watch this online as well. An incredible movie about gangsters malls, and again, the endurance of corruption within the city. I'm going to show the final image, which is in a way a more modern image. Our central character, who's called Kwa, is the girlfriend of gangster Bin. She takes the rap for something that he does. She goes to jail for 5 years, and when she comes out, the city is changed. Everybody around her has gone into corporate crime, corporate corruption, and she is left on her own to navigate the city. But the film goes beyond there with wonderful views of the Three Gorges Dam prior to flooding. I'm going to finish there with sex, violence, mystery, and romance, and I'll be happy to take questions later on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Louise, for taking us into the dark underbelly of the city, and also for setting up lots of themes that I suspect we'll come back to do with dualism in the city, its different sides. Now, I am next on the list, I believe, so I will share my own screen. And I will offer you a proposition to begin with, which is that romance and the city go together because what they both have in common is possibility. So in order to do this, I'm going to act the part of the flaneuse this afternoon and meander through some of my ideas of the city and of romance in a kind of verbal derive. To paraphrase Guy Debord, I'm letting myself be drawn by the attractions of this terrain and the encounters I have found there. When I was 9 years old, in 1984, Bronski Beat released this song, and I'll play you a very quick clip of it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it already. I'll stop there in the tantalizing appearance of suburbia and red buses. To me now, this seems the quintessential representation of a story that is familiar to many of us, the escape from parochialism and the past to the possibility of the big city, courtesy of the then glamour of the ScotRail Express service. If the city is a place of romantic and sexual possibility, it's also in a strange reverse for small town boys like Jimmy Somerville, who you saw there, and small town girls like myself, a place of greater safety. I grew up not as a street haunter, as Virginia Woolf described herself, but as a library haunter. Small towns don't enable street haunting in the way that cities do. You're too visible, you're too recognisable, and as I once found myself writing in a novel, to walk without a dog was considered morally suspect. We can visit cities in the library though, and by the serendipity of choosing a book by its cover or by the exoticism of the names on its spine. And the spines I was attracted to said things like Colette and Aeneas Nin. It seemed to me as a teenager that lesbianism was a city phenomenon, albeit one limited to Paris in between the fin de siècle and the 30s. And this is an image of the booksellers and lovers Sylvia Beach and Adrienne Monnier in Shakespeare and Company in Paris. Because where else but the city might we find other people like us, including, of course, the reflection of ourselves in the eyes of a romantic other? We all tend to visit cities imaginatively before we visit them in person. Glasgow was my closest city growing up, and it could be seen as an anomaly. At least it could back then. We might recall Duncan Thaw's conversation with his friend McAlpin in Alistair Gray's Lanark. "Glasgow is a magnificent city," said McAlpin. "Why do we hardly ever notice that?" "Because nobody imagines living here," says Thaw. "Think of Florence, Paris, London, New York. Nobody visiting them for the first time is a stranger, because he has already visited them in paintings, novels, history books and films. But if a city hasn't been used by an artist, not even the inhabitants live there imaginatively. So if romance is possibility, as I'm suggesting here, then surely it's also imagination." By 1994, I was living in a city myself, and I went to see a film. I'll show you a clip of it now. It's one that had a huge impact on me. So as Lily suggested, sometimes it's the very ordinary hidden places of cities that are the most romantic, the fast food restaurants and so on. The film's called Chungking Express, and these pictures show Chungking mansions in Hong Kong where half of it's set. The director, Wong Kar-wai, is something of a master of making films about love that are set in cities, but Chungking Express is the one that he describes as a love letter to his home city of Hong Kong. His vision of romance in the film, as I said, really did stick with me, and almost a decade after seeing it for the first time, it prompted me to write another novel, Spin Cycle, that picked up on similar themes of romantic obsession. So about the same time as I saw Chungking Express, I started looking at photography books that I found in secondhand bookshops. And typically there weren't a lot of photography books because they're quite expensive, and those that there were in my local bookshop seemed quite ridiculously concerned with the technical intricacies of photographing nudes, which meant that basically there were a lot of photos of nudes. The exception was a big and pristine Flammarion edition of a book of Eugene Atget's photos of Paris, which for some intuitive and mysterious reason seemed like an essential purchase. I was looking at it in preparation for today and it cost £20, which was a lot of money for me back then. So here are some very familiar images of Atget's Paris, a place for dressing up, for getting your hair done, for cinching your waist. And these are lovely photos, but they're not the kinds of photos that started my own minor obsession with photography and photographs of place. Instead, I was interested in these kind of photos of Atget's, the ones that over about 30 years he crisscrossed the streets of Paris making, the ones that have nobody in them at all, that show empty places. In a book called Why Photography Matters, Jenny L. Thompson considers these multiple views of the same place, the same staircase, the same street, and writes that they are too carefully made, too numerous. Clearly, the photographer is finding some content and getting some pleasure apart from his success at piling up marketable documents. For the editor of the Flammarion book that I bought, Josiane Satra, the images are perfectly suited to seducing our own 21st century, so adoring of its past. Yes, I think they are, but I think there's another kind of seduction at play. When I look at these photos, there's a tantalizing sense for me of something just out of view, beyond the frame or waiting the close-up enlargement that will reveal its mysteries. And that sense for me is a sense of pleasure, certainly, but a sense of intimacy and entanglement with the built environment, and a sense of possibility. Where cities are concerned, possibilities are often romantic. This is another great documenter of Paris life, Brassai. In his collection, Paris by Night, we see the demi-monde that we so often crave in cities, a place where inhibitions are released, where rules are slackened, and where romance turns sexual. But like Atget, Brassai also liked photographing these empty spaces with nobody in them at all. And for me, these are the more romantic images, not because they're nostalgic, although undoubtedly they are, But because I find more possibility in the closed door in the wall, in this lovely snaking path round the park here. And thinking about this as I look at these images, I wonder when we feel romance most acutely. Sometimes it's when we're alone, when we're single or separated from our beloved, or better still, on our way to being newly reunited. Many of Brassai's photos of people are very clearly posed, like the ones I showed a moment ago, which makes perfect sense. The city, with its inevitable constant audience, is an ideal backdrop to our performance of ourselves and of our lives. This image is called Misty and Jimmy Paulette in a Taxi by Nan Golden, who, above all other photographers, allowed me to inhabit New York imaginatively before I ever set foot there. Nan Golden, of course, also showed the city as not necessarily a place of greater safety for those who may not fit in where they came from, but as a place of risk, as Louise discussed, not just risk in terms of violence, but risk in the very intimate setting of the romantic relationship. Which maybe leads on to a book that I read recently by Leslie Kern, Feminist City, which I'm sure a lot of you will be much more familiar with than me. For her, the city of possibility is the feminist city. And in a review in The Druth, Andrea Gibbons suggests that a tool for navigating the city as a woman might be accompagnamento, a term central to the Zapatista movement for the enactment of solidarity. But like accompaniment, it can also translate to a simple moving side by side through the city with someone else. What do you learn? What do you see? If we think of being in a city with a lover, doesn't it become much more than it was when we visited it alone? I want to return for a second to Jerry Thompson and why photography matters in order to attempt to make a rather risky metaphor. This is one of his statements about photography at its best, and I want to try and repurpose it. He writes, "There exists a balance between the outside, our visible world, which is, whether we are alive to hear it or not, and the inside, the perceiving, shaping intelligence of the photographer. Those two elements cooperate. One side presents a proposition and the other counters it. A new proposition emerges, one also countered in a similar fashion, and on as a progressively refined result appears, something neither partner could have produced alone." And I want to use that as a metaphor to ask, what is a romantic partnership but something accretive that neither partner could have produced alone? When we participate in romantic relationships, we understand, if we want them to last, that we participate in memory work. We make new memories, often, of course, capturing them via our smartphone cameras, and we recall old memories together, often employing the same means. To finish up, I'll return to a final image from Chungking Express, where I began, and it shows one of the characters on the central mid-level escalator in Hong Kong. I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to go to Hong Kong for work and to end up in this very escalator. In my mind, of course, was this movie that had affected me so deeply. Beside me, though, was my partner, Louise. And together we looked through the thick perspex that surrounds the escalator at the heating vents and the air conditioning units and all those things that you see as you go past apartment blocks. And for me, it was a moment in the present, but a moment in memory too, a moment in imagination and a moment together. It was for me a great example of a moment of romance in the city. Thank you very much for listening to me there. And I will now hand over to Will to share his thoughts about romance in the city from a different lens. Will.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, very different lens, but it's been really interesting how many potential crossovers there might be in the short time we'll have for chat at the end. So I think someone is going to play my video for me. So yeah, that was by way of introduction what I'll be talking about, not just that film, but the kind of films that some of you might be familiar with about how properties, and often luxury properties, are kind of marketed to men, always to men. And I'm really interested, this invite gave me an opportunity to look at them and think about them with a romantic lens and see how romance is kind of folded into these narratives and dramas and marketing structures, devices, which, you know, are not new marketing devices going back for hundreds of years. But see how they fold into like views of the city, literally, but also how these places are kind of imagined as parts of the city or parts of the self or parts of a romantic heterosexual coupledom. So I'll leave some playing in the background and occasionally I'll stop talking to listen in, but some of these motifs in this video recur a lot. There's a lot of sensuality and touching of things. There's a lot of coffee, like more coffee than you can imagine. In fact, you'd think you were buying coffee rather than a flat if at the end of one of these adverts. There's often a motif of like a city symphony motif of like the morning to the evening. The city symphony, which saw the cities wake up and go through the mechanics and the processes of the day before the end of the day when the city kind of winds down again. So it's the same motif you get here, but the house is central rather than the city. You get a lot of other capitalist fetishized objects of purchase like cars and electronic goods. You get a lot of kind of women in sexy lingerie type clothing like this, and the men always go to work in a high-powered suit, driving off somewhere into that distant city. I think this one's Vancouver, to do something very important in a meeting. While the women stay at home, they might go jogging, do some yoga. Sometimes they paint a picture. They always chop some fruit, ready for when the husband's coming back from work. When there's also a glass of wine readily waiting for the husband, and then they sit down usually to eat something very different to what was being prepared in the montage you watched before. So yeah, there's this very heteronormative structure set up already, and ideas of I'm interested in this idea of the sanctuary, the home, and the city. And so sometimes you go into the city like here, but it's only for this excursion. You always end up jogging back to the home, and the home is this sort of the place which is not only the place of security, which touches on what was being talked about earlier by Louise, but also a place of kind of part of the romantic relationship you have with the city and your partner, who's now home from work, because remember he's got a nice smart car, so that was to remind us that he's going to choose which bottle of wine to have tonight. And something else, a motif that has more technology, something else that always happens in these films is as the sun sets, you'll have your glass of wine. See, she was chopping strawberries and now they're eating vegetables. I don't understand what's going on there. Women have a lot of baths and they often go to pools just to sit by them. Men rarely have baths or go swimming in these films because they're in the suit all the time. So often as the sun sets, you will then drift back to the balcony with a view of the city, which I'll touch on a bit later in the talk. So he's even working from home. He just loves his work, this guy. I mean, a lot of wine. When the sun sets, the coffee turns into wine. So you get these kind of different relationships of imbibing and sort of sensuality to a place. And you always end up here, whether the fireworks are kind of a symbolic, suggestive phrase like the pan to the fireplace in a film, I'm not sure. But they're always very heteronormative. And it's always where property is bound up with sort of capitalism and luxury. And it's always romance as a private act as well. So rarely do you see eyes meet over a marketplace or in the bookshop, which was being talked about earlier. You know, one of these great things of the cities and even of capitalism, if you're talking about adverts, is bookshops and the places where people of different classes and backgrounds can meet, and you can do those things of pulling a book out of a shelf and seeing someone's eyes the other side. But you never get that. The romance in these stories always has to come back to the house, the fetishized object, and always being with someone who's very like-minded to you. So not the accidental urban encounter where you then might discover someone, but it's someone who it's safe. Oh, look, she's getting the dinner. He's a bit tired, waiting. View of the city, candlelit dinner. They're probably going to head to their balcony in a moment. And And it's always heterosexual, because you have to think these are being marketed at the men, these adverts. These are being marketed at usually the men in the suits with the flashy cars. And the wife, kind of, or the romantic institution, and the wife comes as part of that purchasing package. You get the house, you get the car, you get the suit. This is the only instance I found of a homosexual hint in any advert I've seen, so I'll just leave it to play.
What we choose to seek,
and it's fleeting.
How we spend our time, and of course, who we spend our time with. In a city so vibrant, so creative, it's not a question of if, but how you will be inspired. Whether across the table or across the river, you can't escape that feeling. That is New York.
So we're going to jump into briefly some pictures which were kindly Crystal Benez, who's a researcher and architect, a writer, let me use. And she's really interested in what she calls aesthetic development images. And these couples, these, quite toxic looking, and when they're put onto hoardings rather than in the adverts like that, they're really in the face of the people that are often being dispossessed. And I think they're quite violent, these acts of hoardings. But this idea of using something romantic and sublime and sort of enticing and often alluring as something which is quite an aggressive act of demolishing social housing estates to build this kind of luxury, to build this kind of lifestyle and these dreams. And then how, and even romance is a tax-efficient leasehold option, so romance is always here about money, and it's about being an original, about going out like a sort of so this is what I mean. So this touching in what's romantic to one can be struck as the enemy to another, and how romance can easily go into what was hinted at earlier, sexiness as well.
It all
I will leave this one to play. This is absolutely terrifying. More terrifying than the films we saw earlier.
London is like a living work of art, a fabulous landscape of remarkable monuments and bold new ideas. Steeped in history, lavished in culture, with excitement at every turn. I had everything planned from the moment we arrived. We began with a visit to some of those exclusive boutiques she loves so much. Well, I knew all the time her ultimate surprise was being prepared. What made it even better for me was having complete confidence in Harrod's concierge making preparations for the evening. All we had to do was enjoy the very best of London. In the afternoon, we indulged our love of art and culture at London's galleries and museums. It's hard to define what makes a day perfect. It can be the moment, or delighting in the anticipation of what's to come. Sometimes it's about knowing everything is as it should be, and of having a dream that is about to be realized where every meticulous detail has already been imagined, designed, and crafted. As we arrived at 1 Blackfriars, I explained that she was welcome to make herself feel at home while I slipped away. I'm here to acquire the sculpture she adores. Delicate, elegant, perfectly formed. Qualities that I know she appreciates as much as I do, and why I know my final surprise will be the best of them all. When something is right, you know it, you feel it. When something is right for you, then you have to make it yours. She was curious about my earlier absence and about what I planned for the evening. But you know, I think that maybe she guessed it already. After all, we share a passion for elegance, for design, for perfection in every detail. We both love beautiful things. And I purchased this river-facing apartment overlooking St. Paul's Cathedral because everything about 1 Blackfriars is exceptional. From the attention that has been lavished on the interior to the remarkable view of London's classic landscape. To every sensuous curve of this elegant building. One Blackfriars is London's latest masterpiece by St. George plc.
So I'm glad that you're all on mute, because otherwise there would be this cacophony of laughing, crying, vomiting and screaming, I think. Yeah, it's really interesting. Like they do go into the city, like they use it as a selling point, and even the romantic parts of it, like, you know, going to Tate Modern and having that moment, and they say we love to experience the culture of London while standing in the turbine hall where there's absolutely nothing in that room. You know, there's just each other, or going in front of a Rothko, but they're not looking at the Rothko, they're just looking at one another. So they hint at this romance, and they say that sort of this romance has to be in that kind of place, but it's just a backdrop. I think someone mentioned earlier about the city being a backdrop for the romantic situation. Certainly, it sort of comes up in Lily's comments earlier as well, that like this sort of the emptiness, they found these empty moments even in the city. Obviously, there's another one playing in here in the background. They're universal, these kinds of videos. And it's also about a private exercise as well. So private in the sort of sense of the emotional, in proximity, in the personal, like that couple we saw in that really awful example. And also in the immediate, but now also in private and spatial terms as well. So they all refer to the city, but they kind of focus upon this purchasable object, the luxury flat, or the life is focused around it. And in this example, I think it's really worth watching, silently playing in the background, because all of the romantic spaces you need, all of the spatial situations to be romantic, that sort of Lily talked about, you know, riverside walks and so on and so forth. You don't even need to go into the city in some examples, because kind of like as a resort kind of idea of being in London, they can all exist in one place. So in this particular building, you can go bowling, you can go to the pool, there's a bar, the lounge, the cinema, the swimming pool, sauna, you can be in nature, and you can be in the city from the balcony rooftop view as well, all within your own private bubble, where you're not going to be at risk from having to mix with people, from the crime that's down on the street below. Roland Atkinson, in his book Alpha City, How London Was Captured by the Super Rich, writes, London acts like a machine of forgetting for its disconnected super affluent denizens. Looking down from penthouses and high-rise apartments may induce a kind of social vertigo, a fear of the apparent chaos and social disorganization. Any sense of common inhabitation, reciprocity and altruism is inoculated against by this kind of city life. And perhaps even romance doesn't need to be with other people in some instances. The next video we're going to see, and hopefully I can speak through it in a bit first. He's clearly in love with himself. It's quite a famous example, some of you might know, but it makes me think of Michel de Certeau when he wrote Walking in the City in 1980. And he talks about going up the World Trade Center. And he says, when one goes up there, the viewer leaves behind the mass that carries off and mixes up in itself and any identity of authors or spectations. His elevation transfigures him into a voyeur. It puts him at a distance. It transforms the bewitching world into one which was possessed, into a text that lies before one's eyes. It allows one to read it, to be a solar eye looking down like a god. And there's a lot of kind of this top looking down, which was referenced in Roland Atkinson's book, but also in Stephen Graham's Vertigo, which I'll do a quote from later, which is an excellent book, about this idea of owning the city, being high up. Views of the city, it's a backdrop for this kind of romance. The next one also, I think, you know, we talked about horror films earlier. Some of you might know this next one. I will leave it to play. I think it's about 2 minutes long. And it is absolutely one of the scariest films that's ever been made in any genre. And the man is clearly having a romantic situation kind of is the Yorkshire Ripper, the Patrick Bateman character. That video was pulled by the developer because everyone on the internet was just laughing at it. But it's this privileged perspective, just to wrap up, which I think is really a recurring theme that's worth thinking about in them. That powerful view from high up in the city, which kind of seamlessly melted into the romantic image, the very heterosexual, heteronormative romantic image. Stephen Graham writes in his book Vertical, which is really worth reading, all about height in the city. Culturally, the new vertical shift in urban housing is being tellingly coded. Their vertical ascent by the relatively new numbers of often absent owner-occupiers in the new elite housing towers is widely celebrated and marketed as the answer to all their narcissistic and anti-urban fantasies. The new towers are invariably marketed as luxury cocoons of uber wealth and fortress security that float serenely above the urban landscape. The wider city is usually rendered as a mere aesthetic backdrop of startling and expensive views. So it's about power mainly, and it's always about men and power and the fetish object, which could be the woman, could be the romantic object, could be the thing on the shelf, that sculpture or the building. And these films' romance may seem touching, but it's kind of delivered as an act of power, of possession and status and control. And I'm kind of interested in that marrying of narcissism, power and romance. And height as a security above the complex mess and danger of the city, where I think romance actually is encountered and accidentally happens, where your possessions and love can be sort of sacrosanct and protected. And I just wonder how strong a romance it is, this kind of romance, if it has to be safeguarded by this verticality, if it has to be packaged up in luxury gifts and secreted away into bubbles of private containment, instead of being let loose into the real city to kind of fend for itself and be resilient in the face of temptations, of chaos and seediness and ruin and people of different social structures. So I'll finish up there, but I think there's a few interesting parallels between everyone in this very eclectic mix of presentations we've had. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Will. That was, I'm ashamed to say, tremendously enjoyable at the same point as being dreadfully troubling. I feel as though we've probably all slightly seduced by the images while worrying, as you say, about seeing the city as this marketing backdrop that could be anywhere. Lily told us about the city as a special place where we find, we find things that resonate with us and become special to us. And Louise talked about imagination and fiction in the city. But there's another word that Lily mentioned, and I think you might have mentioned too, that I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on. And maybe we should go to Lily first of all here. But it's about the essence of a city. Is there such a thing? And how or where do we find it? Clearly not elevated above it in these horrific videos, but what is it for you, and where have you found it, or what are your strategies for finding it? Lily, shall I hand over to you first?
Sure. Well, first of all, there were different essences to a city. And so I think that's very important. And it is also geared to our interests as well. And so I'm terribly interested in history, so I'm always looking for how history has told its story and evolved. And so I'm looking for these destinations and these places within a city that are really evocative of what it means to be that place. And so kind of going against the cliches as well. So that's very important. And so I think that in Paris, the essence is philosophical as well. And so we think of Paris, we think of being free as well. We think of being able to flâner, which is a concept a lot of you have mentioned. And so experiencing the city walking is part of the essence too. And so also kind of taking in the city and its streets and these quiet kind of narrow streets with these interesting perspectives on its sites. And so I think what's really important is getting a little bit off the beaten path, but also a little bit like in the Aceh photos, also having these perspectives on a place that maybe come from a different angle. And so those, I think, are really important features in kind of seeking the romance of the destination.
Thank you. Gosh, again, I'm just tantalized by the prospect of walking around a city doing that again. What about you, Louise? Do you have a sense of the essence of a city? Does it exist? How would you find it or get to know it?
I I was captivated by Will's films, and in all the wrong way. I was thinking about J.G. Ballard, and you mentioned Patrick Bateman and the 50 Shades of Grey, all these kind of S&M type images. But no, I think there isn't an essence of a city. I think the city is different things to different people, and that's the exciting thing about it. And it can reflect our physicality, but it reflects our interests. And we've all had that fantastic, as Lily's talking about, we've all had that fantastic experience of walking our own streets with a friend and then pointing out something that we never noticed, that we walked past 100 times. So I think that there isn't an essence of a city for me. There are individuals, and we all see things differently and then come together, hopefully brilliantly and safely after COVID.
What about you, Will? Do you have a secret desire to be riding the elevator, the private elevator, no doubt, to one of these wonderful apartments to capture the city? And
I'd love to be in kind of have that financial opportunity, but probably not what I choose to do. I just wonder about the word essence, whether it's kind of too dangerous and narrowing, and kind of this idea of distilling something as complex and awkward and messy historically and complex as a city, whether that's a small city or a massive one like Edinburgh or London or Paris, is kind of just not, it can't help but fall into that sort of cliche that that Lily was worried about falling into, because what is an essence to me is not to anyone else. But then we saw that lovely picture of Rio, for instance, in the first presentation, and the idea of a height and looking over the sort of the romantic, I've been in Rio, the flickering romantic light of the sort of the favelas up on the hill, and how gorgeous they are, and they are as you sort of sit in your luxury hotel overlooking them, but that isn't their purpose, to be flickering beautiful candle lights in the distance for people that are spending £500 a night in a hotel. There's people there who, they're fantastic, excited, complicated places of people living. There's violence there, and there's opportunity, and there's all kinds of things. But for it to become like just a backdrop, I think is a bit tricky. And that's when essence has to get distilled, because essence then becomes a backdrop or the marketing pitch or the poster. So I don't know. I don't know if it's as easy as that, and I don't know if I'd want it to be. I do know that when I met my boyfriend, the first date I took him on in London after he moved here was, pun not intended, I took him down the canal on a romantic walk along the canal, because I didn't want to just go down the most cliche, like Primrose Hill or the park overlooking the city. But I thought, when you're down the canal looking up and you see everyone's back gardens, and you see the dirtier bits, you see the polluted water and stuff, as other people have talked about, I think that's more of an essence that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And thinking personally, one of the most romantic things I can remember, and thinking about possibility, is the car breaking down and sitting on a lay-by for ages with my beloved when we had been apart for a month. And the possibility there, when we finally got the AE out in the car to start and got where we were going, seemed much more romantic than whatever it was we planned to do when we, originally. As we're living in different cities ourselves, and Will's given that great example of the canal. Louise and Lily, in your different cities, is there anything romantic or surprising that you've discovered in lockdown that you'll take away from this strange time we found ourselves in? Lily, how about you?
Well, we had a very specific lockdown here the first time around, where we were confined to 1 kilometer, which is about a 15-minute walk, no matter which way you go. And so it was about discovering, like you were talking about too, what is right there in front of us. And so I think we do have a lot to discover within our own proximity that we perhaps neglected before. And so there are all these kind of little special points of maybe stopping to enjoy a place and enjoy what is around us more than we would have in the past.
Yeah, Louise, what about you?
As you know, we're on Friday, we're going to be allowed to travel out with our health districts for the first time since Christmas, but we've been confined not within such a short area. The cemeteries, the necropolis, the different necropolis within Glasgow, which are in effect fantastic parks, and you can read the past there, and we can read a lot about the colonial past, a lot about gendered past, and yeah, the cemeteries, and also community gardens, which have been doing fantastic work during the current lockdown.
Yeah, and those spaces that communities make themselves must be the antithesis of these buildings that Will showed us. Will, where should we head to in London when we get to come back to London?
Oh gosh, well, I mean, 8 million people in London, the first thing they'll do is want to leave London because we're all bloody fed up of it. I went for a walk with a friend the other day and he said, oh, should we walk down the street you're not so familiar with? And I was like, I know every back street of the 5 miles radius of my house now after a year and a half of this. So I think a lot of Londoners are going to be heading straight out to the city, which means it might be a great time for everyone else to come and visit London. But I wouldn't go straight to, I've got the worst possible places like Leicester Square and Trafalgar Square and Camden. They're all a bit hellish. How do you go in London? One of my favourite places in the city is, and it's interesting, I was talking to students about it just the other day, it's right next to 9 Elms and the horrible massive things we saw in those videos, that sort of development's happening, but just to the north, or the northeast, and just off to one side, there's a place called Bonnington Square, which was a squat in the 1970s. And it was the only bit that wasn't sort of demolished and built for main roads. And it was taken over by squatters and gardeners, and now it's very expensive, the ones which are owned by different people. But you step off the main road and the horrible Vauxhall Gyratory and you're suddenly in a different city. And there's a lovely little restaurant there anyone can cook in for other people. There's lovely little community gardens. You can have a Negroni and forget the pollution 10 meters away.
Great. Well, I think that everybody now deserves a Negroni or chosen equivalent. Thank you so much for everyone coming along and joining us for this first event, and for your kind comments and participation in the chat. Thank you to Rachel and the Academy of Urbanism for letting us take over part of your Fringe, and especially thank you very much to Lily, Louise and Will for their wonderful presentations. There are more events coming up, as you can see on the slide, on the 21st every day in the city, and then on the 28th, Play in the City, both of which look excellent. Now, I don't know if there's anything else that I ought to say, Rachel, or if that is us releasing people to plan their travels or go for their evening city walks.
Well, thank you, Zoe, and thank you to all of our speakers tonight. That was a great journey that you've taken us all on. As Zoe said, there are 2 events coming up next week and the week after. And if you're not a member and you enjoyed tonight, have a look at our website for more information about the Academy of Urbanism. And yeah, thank you very much to everybody who's been involved in putting this together. Raise our virtual...
maybe we should unmute for a second, and then we can have a non-virtual round of applause for the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, everybody.
We hope to see you next week.